Hello and welcome to Lesson 9, the Second Berlin Crisis.
With me on my right is Mr. Suter and Mr. Raine. Very important off the top not to get this crisis confused with the Berlin airlift. The Second Berlin crisis will be centered around the building of the wall, and it's a very important distinction you need to make because oftentimes students inadvertently answer incorrectly questions on the Berlin crises. So we're talking here about the crisis that evolved from 1955 to 1961. It's linked to, but nothing to do with, as far as your exam is concerned, with the Berlin airlift of 1948-49.
So, obviously, as you remember from the first couple of lessons, Germany was divided between East and West, but Berlin in and of itself was also divided, even though the fact that Berlin was in East Germany. Remember, that's the whole thing about the Berlin blockade, that Berlin was in East Germany, however, the Allies had places there. However, by the 1950s, Berlin, or West Berlin, had recovered massively. Now, this is in part essentially America trolling the East by pouring lots of money into building flash houses, making sure everyone had jobs, and basically selling, using West Berlin as almost propaganda across the border to show, look how amazing capitalism is. And so what we see is in West Berlin, a fantastic capitalist utopia almost coming up and becoming a real symbol of capitalist prosperity. Now, obviously, to poorer East Germany, and more broadly Russia, it's not ideal to have such a sort of token of sort of capitalist success. And we see, as a result, East Germans fleeing across the border for what they see as a better life in the West, and the way to get there is through Berlin. You can just cross the street and now you're in the West and you can get a flight to go over. Okay, so what essentially happens is we massive fleeing of refugees all the way, and these particulars we shall see are highly skilled, highly educated workers, engineers, doctors, those sort of things, rather than poor labourers, people that the East could not afford to lose. Now, the USSR, is obviously keen to block this gap. It looks bad if people are fleeing. You're losing a lot of well-skilled labourers who you spent a lot of time and money training up. But also, it's just not good to have such an obvious token of capitalism on your doorstep showing off to your neighbours. As well as this, for any watchers of many of the spy films in this period, Berlin is where all the spying goes down. It's a very easy crossing to get into the East. If you're a spy, you go into West Berlin, you sort of slink across the border, and you go to Siberia or wherever you want to go. If the USSR had control of West Berlin, then it'd be harder for the spies to get through.
So what made East Germany so bad? Obviously, when compared directly to West Germany, the economic and political conditions were incredibly bad. West Germany had a free democracy. People could vote for their elected political leaders. The West, the United States and the British make a real propaganda success of just how free and open West Berlin is by comparison to the East. And the East people and the people living on the other side of the border really need not look very far to see that their political system, corrupt by Western standards, completely dominated by Moscow, is producing an economic situation for them where they cannot improve their standard of living. Simply put, Stalin's old idea of keeping Germany down put East Germany on such a bad footing compared to the West that it becomes incredibly pronounced by the middle of the 1950s. Stalinistic policies like the forced collectivization of agriculture and the end of sort of private trading and the private business, if you will, were not necessarily popular. He tries to drive a hardline communist approach here that isn't really popular when all you have to do is really look across the street and you see that in West Germany things are completely different and people are apparently thriving. Not to mention the fact that the communist system wasn't working as efficiently as the system in the West. There were shortages of consumer goods, things people wanted. You'd have a waiting list, for instance, if you wanted to buy a car of up to 4 or 5 years, if you could even afford one. If you wanted a refrigerator, you'd have to wait a year. It was really, really hard to get your hands on the basic necessities of sort of modern life as they were sort of developing in the 1950s and 1960s. All of this, of course, contrasts with the fact that if you wanted a toaster, you could buy it easily and cheaply in the West. In the East, you'd have to apply for it.
So, this chap here, the guy, Eisenhower is a new president we haven't quite seen. Harry Truman is the last chap we talked about, Democrat. He's replaced by Eisenhower in the early 1950s. Eisenhower is an ex-general, and actually he's a relatively unpolitical man. Without going into too much detail, he was the guy who masterminded D-Day, was a senior general when on the Allied invasion of Germany, and was a guy who both the Democrats and Republicans desperately wanted to run on their presidential tickets. He is a man, though, because he was an ex-soldier, who also does not necessarily like war. He's been there, he's seen it, he does not want to get in there again, and this will inform a lot of what Eisenhower will do. So, in 1958, Khrushchev suggests that the four occupying powers should leave Berlin and make it a neutral city. What that means is no one has any control of Berlin. That means both the French, the British, and Americans, but as well as that, the Russians will just leave Berlin to be Berlin. The President Eisenhower, wanting to show goodwill and wanting to try and improve relations between the Cold War, even though most historians suspect he would never quite give that in, said he was prepared to make discussions. And in 1959, Khrushchev was the first Soviet leader to visit the USA, and they further agreed to meet in Paris in 1960 to discuss Berlin in more detail. The initial meeting was more of a let's just show that we're willing and let's show that we're keen. The Paris meeting was where you'd actually do most of the discussions.
The 1959 visit of Khrushchev to the United States is actually quite interesting. I challenge that we have a picture of them picking corn somewhere in the Midwest, but in his goodwill trip to the United States, Khrushchev actually, funny enough, becomes fascinated by cowboy stuff, and he ends up wearing a cowboy hat most of the time. It's just an interesting character, and I think it's funny to watch Khrushchev wear a cowboy hat. Other than that, anyways, continue.
To discuss Berlin and nuclear weapons, and so we see a real period of actually optimism, and you can talk about this sort of 1950 to 1959-60 period of one of the relationship thawing as this more peaceful, orientated status quo. Eisenhower, he doesn't want to give in to Russia, but he believes in coexistence.
But Khrushchev talks a good game, too. I mean, Stalin's dead. He comes to power a couple years later after a rather contentious and power battle. He gives his secret speech where he talks about lessening the Stalinistic policies. He goes to the United States. He wears a cowboy hat. He makes himself seem friendly. Most people in America think, you know, this is someone we can work with. This Cold War nonsense is going to end.
And I think what's core to this Cold War course is to realize that Khrushchev is not Stalin. And I would say, as we get onto the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev is increasingly the good guy out of the two. We'll come in that in more detail.
But goodwill profoundly ends, and you can argue that the United States is somewhat responsible for this. In the very first lesson, we talked about the different things in the Cold War. One of the things we talked about was spying, and there was a picture of a giant plane. That plane is known as a U-2 spy plane, not the band U2, though they're named after the spy plane. The U-2.
I don't know what the band U2 is.
Of course, Bono.
He's like 90.
Anyways, moving forward, the U-2 spy plane was developed in the 1950s and used by the United States to spy on the Russians. It had an incredible capability of flying at a really high altitude. It actually could fly just on the edge of the atmosphere of Earth and then use its high-tech photography lenses to take very detailed pictures of what was going on in Russia. It was much clearer and could be more targeted than say, satellite technology, which is relatively new at this time. And it gave the United States a window into what the Russians were doing. Obviously, the Russians didn't like this, and of course, they would try and shoot these planes down because going over Soviet airspace without permission is effectively illegal. Now, the belief was with the United States is because these planes flew so high that the Soviets did not possess missile technology capable of firing a missile and to shoot a U-2 spy plane down. However, they were wrong because 9 days before Eisenhower and Khrushchev were scheduled to meet again in May of 1960, an American U-2 spy plane flown by a guy named Gary Powers was shot down by a Soviet missile. The plane itself crashed somewhere over Siberia. Gary Powers was able to eject from the plane and parachute down to Earth, where he was arrested and put on basically a show trial. Khrushchev, angered by the U.S. incursion in the airspace, demands that all flights stop and the USA apologize.
I think what's important to realize is that Khrushchev knew, as did most Soviet leaders, knew that the spy planes were happening. And the problem, and they hadn't really demanded before this. So what's the change? Like, the spy planes have been going over for at least 5 to 6 years. They've known about it. They've shot at them before. They've not been shot down, and they've just sort of kept it quiet. What's different? Now it is public. Now people know that Russia knows that they're being spied on. Before, Russia knew they were being spied on, but no one knew they knew. So like, they didn't have to do anything. But now that the world suddenly goes, hang on, Russia knows they're being spied on, what does Khrushchev have to do? He has to make like it's a big deal and respond to it. So the problem is not necessarily just they are being spied on, but it's the fact that people know that they're being spied on, and now they have to react.
Yeah, so that actually pushes Khrushchev to take a much harder line than he had in the last 3 or 4 years. He demands that Eisenhower stop flights, in which he doesn't, and he demands an apology, which Eisenhower does not give. Khrushchev walks out of the first meeting, so they meet again in Paris, and Eisenhower then cancels a trip to the USSR. Basically, relations fall apart. Khrushchev is completely fed up. He's making a big show of it, but relations between the two powers over the U-2 spy plane become very, very cold.
I think what's very important to realize is Eisenhower offers to stop the flights, but not apologize. The issue was never really about the flights. It's become a Cold War sort of standoff about reputation and face saving, rather than the flights themselves. And actually, although Eisenhower promised to stop the flights, but not do that publicly and not apologize, Khrushchev wants his pound of flesh from it. Khrushchev wants to show that he's won this conflict. Eisenhower won't give in his own prestige and his own sort of image of strength to give in like that. So we find a standoff, or Mexican standoff, which ends up with both parties storming out, almost without even wanting to some extent. They're almost forced to, because one person has to react, the other person can't let be weak, so they have to stand off, and Khrushchev has to react, and then Eisenhower has to react.
It's important to note that Khrushchev feels he has the upper hand because nominally it's the US's fault. They were spying on them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what Khrushchev decides to do is to talk more harshly or more vociferously about the issue in West Germany. The spy plane incident makes several issues regarding West Germany more worrying. Number one, the fact that in 1955 West Germany joins NATO, which makes it a military threat to the Soviet zone. And in 1957, West Germany joins the European Economic Community, the EEC, the precursor to the modern EU, which also strengthens its trade, it strengthens its economy, and it makes its connections with Western Europe incredibly strong. So West Germany begins to flourish at a very, very rapid rate, and not to mention the fact that they're part of a military alliance. The issue of West Germany becomes very much problematic.
So, and one of the best ways to describe it, in fact, is Khrushchev describes it as a fishbone in his throat, i.e. it's a small, insignificant thing at a vital location, which is causing irritation and perhaps all sorts of problems. So, Berlin, in the context of the wider sort of world, but also the fact that refugees were starting to go across even more, spies were available more, and just the propaganda value of Berlin more, Berlin starts becoming a massive, massive problem. Khrushchev feels like he's got the upper hand, as Mr. Raine says, and in Mr. Raine, and as a result, he thinks now is the time to start putting pressure on Berlin, getting rid of this fishbone. He's got this license to be angry, he's got the license to be annoyed, and therefore he can start trying to minimize its sort of role, and perhaps even getting control of it. So this is made all the more urgent that from January 1961, we see a massive increase in the number of refugees from East Berlin, going up to about 20,000 a month. This is a huge drain of labour, particularly the brains, the skilled labour and the educated workforce who are going over. The general sort of still working in Siberia are not going. It's the professors, it's the doctors, etc., who are going. And this is promoting a fantastic problem, as well as giving the West fantastic propaganda opportunities. Look how good we are and bad they are. People are fleeing. If people are fleeing for your country, generally things are not going well. And it's really, really useful for them.
So this all comes to a head at the Vienna summit. Now, of course, Eisenhower's term ends by 1960, and the new president is elected, President John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy meets with Khrushchev and sets up almost immediately a summit in Vienna, Austria. Khrushchev looks at the goings-on in the United States and thinks John F. Kennedy is weak. He sort of passes him off as a dilettante, someone who's not that serious, someone he can push around. He thinks he's young, he's inexperienced. And Khrushchev decides to take a very hard line with the new U.S. President, Kennedy. Kennedy sends a very clear message in his inauguration speech to Khrushchev that he will continue the Truman Doctrine. In other words, the United States will intervene if the Soviets continue to expand. In June of 1961, the two meet for the first time in Vienna, Austria. Khrushchev, again taking his hard line with a man he perceives weak, demands that all Western forces leave West Berlin. This is the idea of a neutral city is completely off the table. He wants everybody out of West Berlin, but Berlin is his, or he will end all occupation rights, including Western access to Berlin. So in fact, he will cut it off. Kennedy, of course, refuses, and in response, he begins to increase defense spending with a very noticeable build-up along the West German border.
What's important to realize is JFK, John F. Kennedy, is being the real Cold War warrior. There is something called brinkmanship, how far you are willing to push, almost like a game of chicken, push until you give in, push towards almost certain death. JFK, as we shall see, is someone who is willing to go all the way to some extent, and it's always Khrushchev who blinks first. By Kennedy increasing defense spending, he's essentially saying to Khrushchev, come at me. Okay, interesting to know that Khrushchev will in turn increase his own spending by 30%. This is a real escalation in tensions. However, once after that point, Khrushchev only got two options. Obviously he's got two options. He either invades Berlin or he gives in and looks weak. Neither are ideal. If he invades Berlin, nuclear war, bad, everyone dies. Not very good. Give in, he looks weak. Apologies. So he decides a third option, which is a face-saving option. It's a way of winning, at least, or trying to look like he's win, but in a way that does not cause war. And this is, of course, the Berlin Wall. Now, just to get this in your head, imagine Berlin and West Berlin. He builds a wall around West Berlin. He doesn't build it around East Berlin, doesn't build it around anywhere else. Like, West Berlin is like a little drop in an ocean, like a little island. It's built about, and therefore he builds a wall around that sort of island, as opposed to anything else. Some people get confused by that. So what this wall does, is initially it's barbed wire, going all the way around with only a few checkpoints which allows people to cross, which are heavily guarded. And as time goes on, it's built up into a full wall with barbed wire, sentry towers, border guards, etc., etc., etc. The entire West Berlin is encircled, which is almost like a physical iron curtain, which, remember, doesn't actually exist as a thing, it's a word. Well, actually now it physically exists to some extent in this small place. So, in reality, I'm going to leave see if I've seen the quote that Mr. Raine decided to put in. The Berlin Wall is an attempt to address the refugee and spying problems. It doesn't massively work for the spying problems. Refugee problems does massively decrease. But more than that, to try and make it look like Khrushchev hasn't lost this escalating game of brinkmanship with JFK. If you remember the Vienna conference, Khrushchev has demanded, I want Berlin. JFK said, no, come at me. And Khrushchev gone, and so he's built a wall instead. Fine, I didn't want it anyway, essentially. Obviously, if you want to be really smug, you can argue that Berlin helps thaw tensions, or at least stop tensions escalating further, because it is something which means that everyone's happy with Berlin, they just ignore it after this point. Okay, so the Berlin Wall, although yes, it's a bad thing, and yes, it's reacting to the Vienna conference, and yes,
it's effectively the end of the debate.
Absolutely right, and that's only a good thing in a world of Cold War, where things just keep escalating unless someone tries to stop it.
So, how did relations worsen? In broad strokes, peace is maintained, but the German people suffer. Germans, especially those in West Germany, felt somewhat let down by the U.S. because Kennedy had not really confronted the USSR. Some Germans looked at this as an opportunity for, perhaps a total German reunification, and that was sort of their hope going into the Vienna summit. What results is a Berlin that's entirely cut off. Khrushchev felt he had beaten Kennedy. He felt that he had made Kennedy look bad, and he had stopped a lot of the major issues that were bothering. The flow of refugees was stopped, and eventually the economy in the East improved because it wasn't necessarily influenced by the West so much.
Important to realize, though, that Kennedy thinks he has won, and only reinforces the image in Kennedy's mind that as long as he just keeps going towards the brink, at least he keeps pushing it, then he's going to win, which will have almost disastrous consequences for the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, and Kennedy will play up his side of the bargain, or his side of the story, pretty well. The wall becomes a symbol that, Germany was basically a tool for the superpowers. Kennedy will famously visit West Germany in 1963, stand right next to the wall, and give a very, very famous speech listened to by millions of people worldwide, including almost the entire population of West Berlin, including many in the East, because, of course, cleverly, they broadcast via loudspeaker Kennedy's speech over the wall. He receives applause for the speech on both sides, and he famously says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which he intends to mean that we are all Berliners, or I am a Berliner, effectively saying that the United States will protect the sovereignty of West Berlin. But in the way he pronounced it, it could be, I guess, taken off or understood in German to me, "I'm a jelly donut." But anyways, a Berliner is a jelly donut. Long story short, the 2 points to make. Yes, obviously tensions increase, but Mr. Suter makes a very good point that in essence, it's not the high point of tension in the Cold War, because more or less the building of the wall solves the Berlin crisis, and Germany remains basically with the status quo for about 30 years. I mean, the ball doesn't come down until 1991. Just another interesting side note before we log off here, there are actually three versions of the Berlin Wall. The first one, as we mentioned, is mostly barbed wire. It's improved on dramatically in the next few years with a sort of a wall of stone being built, as you've seen in the pictures here, and you can see very clearly by 1963. It's not only just barbed wire, there's a full physical wall there with guard posts, and the third wall becomes even more high-tech with a no man's land in between. Mines are placed to prevent people from trying to run across, jump over the wall, etc., etc., and it becomes even more high. It becomes higher, more high-tech. Sensors are put into the wall to determine if there's movement in no man's land, etc. But yeah, the Berlin Wall that you're probably familiar with, if you've seen pictures before, is probably the third version of the wall. The first one was mostly a hastily built barbed wire blockage that would prevent people from running over in the immediate days after Khrushchev's decision to put it up.
I think a very, very important thing to when you think about the Berlin crisis is to think of it more as a prequel to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Its real significance of Berlin is to convince leaders of different things. Kennedy that he can just keep pushing to bring in a win. Khrushchev, a slight inferiority complex, and the idea that, like, I need to win this time, which they both carry over, and explains in part, apologies, that's my phone, both carry over to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which makes that tension, as we shall see, escalate almost to the point of nuclear war.
Okay, so that's all for this lesson. We'll catch you on the flip side. I'm Mr. Raine.
Yes, Suter.